She had practiced the curtsy 100 times in the cold of a borrowed room, and still, the moment she performed it before the Duke of Westhaven, she knew she had made a mistake. Before we go any further into this extraordinary story, if you have ever wanted to disappear and become someone else entirely, if you have ever believed that reinventing yourself was the only way to survive, then this story was written for you. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight, whether you are curled up in London or Lagos, in New York or Nairobi. We want to know you are here with us. And if you love sweeping historical romance that pulls at your heart and refuses to let go, please like this video, share it with someone who deserves a beautiful story, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a single tale. Now, let us return to Isolde Ashworth and the curtsy that gave everything away. It was October of 1814, and England wore its autumn like a warning. The trees along the long gravel approach to Thornmere Hall had shed their leaves in great copper drifts, and the sky above the Westhaven estate sat low and grey, as though the heavens themselves were in no mood for pretense. It was the kind of morning that stripped things to their truth: bare branches, cold stone, honest wind, and it was therefore entirely the wrong morning for a lady to arrive pretending to be something she was not. Lady Isolde Ashworth had left her father's house 4 days prior with a single canvas bag, a letter of false reference written in a hand she was not proud of forging, and a pair of shoes borrowed from her lady's maid. Stout, sensible, utterly loveless shoes that pinched at the heel and reminded her with every step that she was no longer herself. She had cut her nails short. She had rubbed her hands with lye soap until the softness was gone, and the skin was red and plausible. She had unpinned her dark hair from its careful arrangement and tucked it beneath a cotton cap. She had rehearsed a new name, Isolde Marsh, plain enough, forgettable enough, a name that carried no estates and no expectations and, most importantly, no betrothal contract to the Viscount Dravecourt. She had not looked back as the carriage that carried her from Ashworth Manor disappeared into the morning mist. She had told herself she would not cry, and she had not, which surprised her, for she had always believed herself to be somewhat sentimental. Perhaps desperation, she had concluded, was a great cure for sentiment. Thornmere Hall had appeared before her like something from a painting, imposing and enormous, all pale stone and tall windows that caught the weak autumn light and held it like a secret. The estate was vast and well-ordered, the kind of household that ran on precision and tradition, where every servant knew their place and every silver fork knew its drawer. It was exactly the sort of house, Isolde had reasoned, where one additional housemaid would go entirely unnoticed. She had reasoned incorrectly, as it turned out. Mrs. Pelham, the head housekeeper of Thornmere Hall, was a woman built like a courthouse, solid, symmetrical, and utterly without mercy. She had received Isolde in the servants' hall with a letter of reference held between 2 fingers as though it carried a faint odor, and she had looked Isolde up and down with a slow, systematic appraisal of a woman who had seen 20 years of liars come and go through that very door. "Isolde Marsh," she had said, making the name sound like a question. "Yes, ma'am," Isolde had replied, keeping her eyes appropriately lowered, her chin at the correct and humble angle. "From Hertfordshire." "Yes, ma'am." "Your previous mistress, Mrs. Colton, speaks well of your work." "She was very kind to me, ma'am." Mrs. Pelham had folded the letter with geometric precision and set it upon the table. "We shall see," she had said, in a tone that suggested Mrs. Colton's kindness and her own were not acquainted with one another. Isolde had been assigned a uniform, grey wool dress, white apron, white cap, and given a small, cold room in the attic that she shared with 2 other housemaids who were asleep when she arrived and gone before she woke. She had lain on the narrow mattress that first night listening to the house breathe around her, the creak of old timber, the distant clatter of the kitchen below, the wind pressing itself against the window pane, and she had told herself, quietly and firmly, that she was safe. That Dravecourt would not think to look for her here, that she had been clever enough, invisible enough, ordinary enough. And then morning had come, and with it, the Duke. She had not expected to encounter him so soon. Indeed, she had understood from the other maids, A bright-eyed girl named Nell had whispered the relevant intelligence over breakfast, that his grace rarely descended from the upper floors before noon, and that his contact with the lower household staff was conducted almost entirely through Mrs. Pelham as intermediary. He was not unkind, Nell had said, but he was private. He kept his own counsel. He moved through his own house like a man accustomed to being watched and determined to give the watchers nothing to see. It was this, Isolde would later think, that should have told her everything. She had been crossing the great entrance hall with a coal scuttle, the most unglamorous of all possible accessories, when the library door had opened and Edmund Cavendish, 5th Duke of Westhaven, had walked out. He was taller than she had imagined a duke might be, though she could not have said why she had imagined otherwise. He wore no coat, only shirt sleeves and a dark waistcoat, and he carried a book open in one hand with the comfortable ease of a man who had forgotten it was there. His hair was dark, slightly disordered, and he had the kind of face that had been handsome once and had become something more interesting than handsome through the passage of experience, a face with architecture to it, with shadows under the cheekbones and a quality around the eyes that spoke of intelligence deployed with great patience. He had looked up from the book. She had done the only thing she could do. She had set down the coal scuttle, smoothed her apron, and curtsied. It was a perfectly executed curtsy. It was light, controlled, unhurried, the posture impeccable, the descent precise, the recovery effortless. It was, in short, the curtsy of a girl who had been taught by a governess at the age of 6 and had performed it at formal occasions no fewer than 300 times across 17 years of aristocratic life. It was not, in any conceivable universe, the curtsy of a housemaid from Hertfordshire. She knew it the moment she rose. She felt it, the terrible stillness in the air between them, the quality of his attention sharpening from the polite and absent notice one gave a servant into something else entirely. Something focused. Something that did not blink. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, the coal-dusted apron, the cotton cap, the borrowed shoes, and then he looked at her face, and something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. And then, without a single word, the Duke of Westhaven tucked his book under his arm, inclined his head in a motion that was almost, a nod of acknowledgement, and walked on. Isolde picked up the coal scuttle. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling. The thing about a life built on deception is that it requires constant maintenance. Like a garden planted in the wrong season, it demands vigilance, water, and the daily removal of every shoot that threatens to grow in the wrong direction. Isolde had understood this in theory. She understood it far more viscerally by the end of her first full day at Thornmere Hall, when her lower back ached from unfamiliar labor, her fingers were stiff from cold water and rough linen, and she had told the name Isolde Marsh to so many different people in so many different tones of practiced ordinariness that it had begun to feel, in some exhausted and peculiar way, almost true. Almost. The morning after her encounter with the Duke, she rose before dawn with the other housemaids, a fact that struck her as quietly barbaric, since the sky beyond the attic window was still the deep, uncompromising black of a night that had not yet decided to end. The girl in the cot beside hers was already moving, pulling on her uniform with the brisk efficiency of someone who had never once considered that the hour was uncivilized. This was Nell. She was perhaps 18, with a round, freckled face and the cheerful energy of a person who found the world genuinely interesting, which Isolde had come to understand was either a remarkable gift or a willful act of self-preservation in a life that offered very little luxury. "You survived the first day, then," Nell said, by way of greeting, pulling her cap over a tumble of ginger hair. "Apparently," Isolde replied, sitting up and resisting the impulse to reach for a bell pull that was not there. "Mrs. Pelham didn't eat you alive. That's something. She had the last new girl in tears by 9:30. Nell said this without malice, merely as a statement of meteorological fact, the way one might observe that it had rained. "You've got steady nerves." Isolde thought of Dravecourt's face at their last meeting, the flat, proprietary calm of him, the way he had looked at her as though she were an acquisition already made, and said, evenly, "I have had practice." Nell accepted this without question, which was one of the finest qualities Isolde would come to appreciate about her. The work of the morning was relentless and specific and left no room for the mind to wander, which Isolde suspected was either a design flaw or a design feature of domestic service, depending on one's perspective. There were grates to be cleaned before the family woke, a task that covered the hands and forearms in fine black ash and required a particular technique with the brush that Isolde did not possess and had to observe Nell performing twice before she could approximate. There were fires to be laid and lit, curtains to be drawn back in the correct sequence across the correct rooms in the correct order. Mrs. Pelham, it emerged, had opinions about the order, and breakfast trays to be carried to the upper landing with a steadiness that Isolde's arms, unaccustomed to such weights, did not immediately supply. She dropped nothing. She considered this a victory of significant personal magnitude. What she could not drop, what threatened, at every turn, to betray her, was herself. It was in the small things always. The way she automatically straightened the silver on a breakfast tray into precise alignment before delivering it, not because she had been instructed to, but because disorder on a table had always vaguely troubled her. The way she thanked Nell for correcting her technique with the ash brush in a tone that was warm but carried the faintest register of someone accustomed to graciousness rather than gratitude. The way, passing a mirror in the upper corridor, she caught her own reflection and, for one unguarded moment, stood straight and looked directly at herself, not with the downward cast of a servant, but with the level gaze of a woman who had always known exactly who she was. She looked away quickly, but not, she feared, quickly enough. Mrs. Pelham was everywhere and saw everything. She moved through the house with the silent authority of a woman who regarded every room as her personal jurisdiction and every member of staff as a variable to be assessed and, if found deficient, corrected. She had not yet spoken to Isolde at length. Their communications thus far had been limited to instructions, corrections, and one deeply unsettling moment that afternoon when the housekeeper had paused in the doorway of the drawing room where Isolde was polishing the lower panels of the wainscoting and simply watched her for a long, unreadable moment before walking on without a word. Isolde had kept polishing. She had counted the strokes. 14, 15, 16. She had breathed through her nose at regular intervals. She had thought very deliberately about nothing. She was becoming, she realized, rather good at thinking about nothing. She was not sure whether this was an achievement or a loss. It was Nell who told her about the Duke, in the hushed and reverent tones that the staff of large houses reserved for the subject of their employers, a kind of biographical shorthand passed from servant to servant like a living document, updated by observation and amended by rumor. "He's not cruel," Nell said, as they polished silver together in the pantry that afternoon, their reflections swimming ghost pale in the bellies of the serving dishes. "I want you to understand that first, because there are houses where the master is cruel, and this isn't one of them. He's just contained, like a letter that's been sealed, and you can't quite read what it says." "How long has he been that way?" Isolde asked, keeping her voice neutral and her attention on the candlestick in her hands. Nell considered. "Long as I've been here, which is 3 years. Cook says he was different before Miss Harcastle. Lighter. More given to company." She lowered her voice, though they were alone. "He was engaged to her. A baron's daughter. Beautiful, everyone said. She threw him over for an earl 6 weeks before the wedding. Turned out she'd been corresponding with the earl the entire time she was at Thornmere, smiling at his grace across the dinner table like she hadn't a secret in the world." Isolde set down the candlestick with more care than the actions strictly required. "He found out," she asked. "Letters," Nell said simply. "A servant found letters. Brought them to him." She shook her head, returning to her polishing with renewed vigor, as though the story required physical dispersal. "He didn't rage. That's what Cook says was the worst of it. He didn't shout or make a scene. He just went very quiet. Gave back the ring through his solicitor. Closed the east wing. And that was that." Isolde thought about the quality of his attention that morning in the entrance hall. The way he had looked at her, not with suspicion, exactly, but with the calm, practiced precision of a man who had learned, at considerable personal cost, to read what lay beneath the surface of things. She thought about her Curtsy. She thought about the fact that he had said nothing. And she understood, with a cold clarity that settled in the center of her chest like a stone dropped into deep water, that his silence had not been inattention. It had been a decision. The question, the only question that mattered, and the one she could not yet answer, was what he had decided. That evening, as the house settled into its nighttime rhythms and the candles in the servants' hall burned low, Isolde sat at the long wooden table and wrote a letter she did not intend to send to anyone. She wrote her own name, her real name, Lady Isolde Ashworth, in the careful, educated hand she had been trained to since childhood, and she looked at it for a long moment. Then she folded the paper, carried it to the kitchen hearth, and let it burn. The ash curled and went dark. She watched until there was nothing left, then took herself upstairs to her narrow bed, where she lay with her eyes open and listened to Thornmere Hall speak in its nighttime voice, and wondered whether the Duke, in his room somewhere above her, was sleeping or, like her, lying quietly awake in the dark, already knowing things he had not yet chosen to say. There are hungers that survive disguise, and for Isolde Ashworth, the deepest of them had nothing to do with food. She had managed without her jewels. She had managed without her silk dresses, her morning chocolate, her private sitting room with its view of the Ashworth Gardens. She had managed without her name. But by the fourth night at Thornmere Hall, lying in the narrow attic bed with the darkness pressing close and her mind refusing to quiet, she understood that she could not manage without books. It was a weakness, and she knew it. It was also non-negotiable. She had noticed the library on her second day, had passed its door in the course of her duties, and caught, through the brief gap where it stood ajar, the particular quality of silence that only rooms filled with books possess. She had kept walking. She had told herself, firmly, that it was not for her, that Isolde Marsh of Hertfordshire would have no occasion and no desire to enter a duke's private library, and that Lady Isolde Ashworth had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. She had believed herself for approximately 48 hours. On the fourth night, when the clock in the servants' hall had long since struck midnight and the breathing of the two other girls in the attic room had settled into the slow rhythm of deep sleep, Isolde rose. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, took the stub of a candle from the small dish on the windowsill, and moved through the sleeping house with the careful, practiced quiet of a woman navigating borrowed territory. The library door opened without sound. She was grateful for that. Grateful, and then immediately troubled by her own gratitude, because it suggested she had been considering this possibility long enough to have worried about the hinges. Inside, the room received her like a held breath finally released. It was larger than she had imagined from the doorway, high-ceilinged and lined on all four walls with shelves that rose from floor to cornice, populated with volumes in every size and shade of binding. A great oak desk occupied the center of the room, its surface clear except for an inkwell, a pen stand, and a single folded letter that she did not look at. Two leather armchairs sat before the fireplace, which still held the remnants of the evening's fire, enough warmth remaining to take the edge from the October chill without quite qualifying as comfort. Isolde raised her candle and tilted her head and began to read the spines. She had intended to take a single volume, return to her room, read until she was calm enough to sleep, and replace the book before the household woke. It was a sensible plan. It accounted for risk. It was the plan of a woman who had survived 4 days of deception through the disciplined management of impulse. She was on her third shelf and quite lost in the architecture of someone else's collection, noting, with the involuntary delight of a reader encountering a kindred mind, that whoever had assembled this library had equal regard for natural philosophy, classical literature, and contemporary poetry, when she heard the door open behind her. She went perfectly still. "The astronomy section," said a voice, "is in the far left corner, if that is what you are looking for." It was a calm voice, low and precise, and carrying the particular quality of a man who is not surprised by what he found, which told her, before she had even turned, everything she needed to know about how this moment had been arrived at. She turned. Edmund Cavendish stood in the doorway in a dark dressing gown, his dark hair disordered in a way that was not unbecoming, holding a candle of his own. He looked at her with that same quality of focused, unhurried attention she had encountered in the entrance hall. The gaze of a man who collected information the way other men collected debts, quietly and with great interest in future application. She curtsied. She could not help it. It was, again, perfectly done. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. "I came to return a book," he said, moving into the room with the ease of a man in his own space, which he was. He crossed to the desk, set his candle beside the inkwell, and placed the volume he carried. She could see now that he had one, on a particular spot on the second shelf with the specificity of a man who knew exactly where everything belonged. Then he turned and looked at her again. "What are you reading?" he asked. Isolde became aware that she was holding a volume of Milton against her chest, as though it were a shield. She lowered it. "I had not yet chosen, Your Grace. I was looking. At midnight. I could not sleep." "Nor could I," he said, without apparent judgment of either of them. He moved to one of the leather chairs and sat, extending his long legs toward the dying fire with the unself-conscious ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own company. "Sit, if you like," he said. "The chair nearest the fire is the better one." Isolde did not sit. Every instinct of self-preservation told her that sitting in the Duke's library at midnight, in conversation with the Duke himself, was a threshold she could not uncross once she had crossed it. Every other instinct told her to sit. She sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire shifted and resettled. The candles held their small, warm territories against the dark. Outside, the October wind moved through the grounds of Thornmere Hall with soft persistence. "Milton," Edmund said, nodding at the volume in her hands. "Yes. Which do you prefer, the early poems or the later?" It was the question of a reader speaking to a reader. Not a duke addressing a housemaid. Not a man testing a story he already suspected was false. Simply a question between two people who had both, separately, chosen a library over sleep on a cold autumn midnight. Isolde looked at him. "The later," she said. "Difficulty earned through experience is always more interesting than beauty that has cost nothing." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Denser. More considered. Edmund reached to the shelf beside his chair, withdrew a slim volume, and held it out to her across the distance between them. "Then try this," he said quietly. "And do not let Mrs. Pelham find you here." Isolde took the book. Their fingers did not touch. But the candlelight moved between them like something alive, and when she finally rose to leave, she found she could not quite remember the cold. There is a particular kind of wound that does not bleed, that leaves no visible mark upon the skin, and yet reshapes everything beneath it, quietly and permanently, the way a river reshapes stone. Edmund Cavendish had carried such a wound for 3 years. He had learned in that time to wear it so naturally that most people could not see it at all. This was, he had concluded, both a social convenience and a personal failure, but it was the arrangement he had arrived at, and he was not, at 34, inclined to renegotiate with himself. He had risen early the morning after the library, as was his habit, and ridden out across the Thornmere estate in the thin gray light before breakfast with the focused, rhythmic purpose of a man using physical exertion to restore internal order. The grounds were wide and frost-touched in the October morning, the grass silver-pale, the lake at the eastern edge of the property lying flat and still as a held mirror. He rode without destination, which was unlike him. He was in virtually all things a man of destination. He was thinking about the maid who quoted Milton. More precisely, he was thinking about what she had said, "Difficulty earned through experience is always more interesting than beauty that has cost nothing," and the way she had said it. Not performing. Not reaching for effect. Simply stating a truth she had arrived at personally, in the direct and unguarded tone of someone who had momentarily forgotten to be careful. He had recognized that moment. The forgetting. He had watched it happen and said nothing, because saying something would have closed it, and he had found, to his own considerable interest, that he did not want it closed. This was new information about himself, and he filed it with the precise, slightly wary attention he gave to all new information. Edmund Cavendish had been 21 when he first learned that a person could look directly at you across a dinner table, day after day, week after week, and show you a face that bore no correspondence whatsoever to the interior it represented. He had been 31 when he learned it a second time, more completely, more expensively, and with the particular devastation of a man who believed he had already taken the lesson and was therefore protected. He had not been protected. Miss Eugenia Hardcastle had arrived at Thornmere Hall in the spring of his 31st year as the guest of his cousin Margaret, who collected beautiful people the way other women collected porcelain. She had been everything that word implied, extraordinarily fair, possessed of a laugh that seemed to contain entire summers, and in conversations so attuned to the interests and thoughts of whoever she was speaking with that one came away from the experience feeling both thoroughly understood and faintly dazzled. Edmund had not been dazzled. He was not, constitutionally, a man who dazzled easily. But he had been, and this was the word he returned to, always, with the grim fidelity of a man re-examining a wound to understand its exact dimensions. Interested. She had interested him. Not with performance or artifice, or so he had believed. She had spoken about ideas. She had disagreed with him, twice, on matters of genuine substance, with an intelligence and assurance that he had found, to his own surprise, enormously attractive. He had proposed 4 months after their meeting. She had accepted with every appearance of sincere joy. The letters had been found by a parlor maid 6 weeks before the wedding, not through any deliberate investigation on Edmund's part, but through the mundane accident of a misplaced desk key and an overturned writing box. They were addressed to the Earl of Casterton, and they predated the engagement by 2 months. Their content was explicit in its strategic dimension, Eugenia calculating, in her own elegant hand, the relative advantages of a duke versus an earl, and determining, ultimately, that Casterton's warmer temperament and more active social calendar represented a preferable daily reality, even at the cost of a lesser title. She had not yet made her final decision when she accepted Edmund's proposal. She had been, the letters made clear, keeping both possibilities warm. Edmund had read every letter. He had read them with the same careful, systematic attention he brought to legal documents and estate accounts, reading not for the pain of it, which was considerable, but because he believed in understanding the full architecture of a thing. He had then placed them in order, tied them with the same ribbon that had bound them, and given them, via his solicitor, to Eugenia's father with a note that was 4 sentences long and entirely without recrimination. He had not spoken of it since. Not to his cousin. Not to his estate manager, who was also his oldest friend. Not to anyone. What he had done, quietly and without announcement, was recalibrate. He had not sworn off women. That would have been dramatic, and he had no patience for drama. He had simply revised his methodology. He watched more carefully. He listened for the gap between what people said and what their bodies communicated. He had always been observant. He became, after Eugenia, precise. It was this precision that had caught the maid's curtsy on the first morning. And it was this same precision that now, in the days following the library, tracked the small and telling details that accumulated around a sold marsh like evidence at an inquest. The way she held a teacup when she thought no one was looking, by the handle, yes, but with the particular cradle of the fingers that spoke of long practice with fine china. The way she moved through doorways, not the functional transit of a working woman always conscious of what she carried, but the unhurried, automatic grace of a person who had never needed to calculate her own passage through a room. The vocabulary she deployed in conversation with Nell, which he had overheard twice from an adjacent room, words like consequently and particular and I should think, delivered without self-consciousness, because they were simply the words she reached for naturally. He had also noted the book she had taken from the library. He had checked the shelf the following morning. She had chosen well. Edmund stood at the window of his study on the afternoon of the 5th day and turned the question over with the methodical patience that was his most reliable characteristic. She was not a maid. This was established, internally, beyond reasonable doubt. She was gently born, almost certainly well above gently, given the curtsy and the diction and the quality of her reference letter, which he had borrowed from Mrs. Pelham's file on the pretext of a routine review and read with the attention it deserved. It was a competent forgery. The hand was educated. The details were plausible but lacked the specificity of genuine institutional memory. A real letter of character contained the mundane, the preferred method of starching, the particular quirk with the Tuesday linens. This one contained only virtues, which was precisely how a well-read person who had never written such a letter would imagine one ought to read. She was hiding. From what or from whom, he did not yet know. He thought about this. He thought about Eugenia, the calculus of her deception, its coldness, its fundamental orientation towards self-interest. He thought about the girl in the library, the way she had looked at the shelves as though they were a homecoming. The way she had taken the book he offered with both hands, carefully, the way one received something of genuine value. He thought about what she had said about difficulty earned through experience. Whatever she was running from, it had cost her something real. He was certain of that. The quality of a person who had chosen this, the attic room, the coal scuttle, the borrowed shoes, over their alternative was not the quality of a person running toward something. It was the quality of a person for whom staying had become impossible. He knew something about that, too. Edmund turned from the window, sat at his desk, and drew a sheet of paper toward him. He did not write anything on it. He sat with the pen in his hand for a long moment, thinking. Then he placed the pen down, folded the blank paper, and put it to one side. He would not investigate further. Not yet. Whatever she was concealing from a position of fear, and whatever else he was not a man who extracted information from frightened women. He would watch. He would wait. And if she chose, eventually, to tell him, she would find him, he decided quietly, a more useful ally than she presently imagined. Across the house, in the servants' hall, Isolde sat at the long table with the volume of poetry he had given her hidden beneath her folded apron, and read 3 lines before Nell called her away to lay the upper corridor fires. She had not stopped thinking about the library either. There are moments when fear arrives not as a wave but as a stillness, a sudden, total quieting of the body, as though every nerve has drawn a breath and held it. Isolde experienced such a moment on the morning of her 7th day at Thornmere Hall, when Nell appeared at the door of the linen room where she was folding pillowcases and said, with the bright, uninvested cheerfulness of someone delivering entirely neutral information, "A Viscount's arrived." Dravecourt, I think the name was. Mrs. Pelham's in a flutter about the dining arrangements. The pillowcase in Isolde's hands remained perfectly still. She had known, in the abstract, that this was possible. Dravecourt was not a man who surrendered possessions quietly, and that was precisely how he regarded her. She knew, with a cold clarity that had settled over her the evening her father had delivered the news of the betrothal. A possession. An arrangement. A signature on a document that converted a woman into a transaction and called it marriage. He was also not a man of limited resource or imagination. If he had traced her here, and the fact of his arrival suggested strongly that he had, or at least suspected, then the 7 days she had spent carefully constructing Isolde Marsh were worth considerably less than she had believed. She finished folding the pillowcase. She placed it on the stack. She breathed. "Is he expected to stay?" she asked, keeping her voice the careful, pleasant neutral of a woman entirely unconcerned. "Overnight at least," Nell said. "Cook's been told to prepare for dinner. 8 covers." She disappeared back into the corridor, already thinking of other things, because Nell had no reason to attach significance to a viscount's name. Isolde had every reason, and could attach nothing else. The hours between that morning and the dinner service were the longest of her life, which was a remarkable distinction given the competition. She moved through her duties with a precision that had nothing to do with diligence and everything to do with the discipline of a mind that could not afford to fracture. She did not allow herself to think about the dining room. She thought about each immediate task, completed it, moved to the next. Grate, curtain, tray, step, breath. When Mrs. Pelham informed her, at 5:30, that 2 of the regular dining room maids were unwell and that she and Nell would be required to assist with the dinner service, Isolde felt the specific sensation of a door closing behind her in a room with no windows. She said, "Yes, ma'am," and went to change her apron. The dining room at Thornmere Hall was long and candlelit. Its table extended to accommodate the evening's company, a local magistrate and his wife, two gentlemen whose connection to the Duke she did not know, a woman of middle years who carried herself with the assurance of someone whose opinion was habitually solicited, and at the far end, at the Duke's left hand, Lord Dravecourt. Isolde saw him the moment she entered with a soup tureen, and she saw him before he saw her, which was the only advantage the evening offered, and she seized it completely. She arranged her face. She regulated her breathing. She became, through the pure application of will, a woman carrying soup. Dravecourt was 38, and handsome in the way that certain things were handsome. All sharp edges and studied presentation, a face assembled for effect rather than expression. He wore his clothes with the aggressive precision of a man who understood that appearance was power, and he spoke, she could hear even from the sideboard, with the smooth and managed confidence of someone who had never genuinely needed to persuade anyone of anything, because the alternative to persuasion had always been available to him. He was speaking now to the Duke about hunting. His voice carried the room with practiced ease. Edmund sat at the head of the table and listened with the polite, non-committal attention he extended, Isolde had come to understand, to things that did not particularly interest him. He responded at appropriate intervals. He was a composed and adequate host. He gave nothing away. As the first course was cleared and the second brought forward, Isolde maintained her orbit of the room's periphery with meticulous care, approaching from the correct angles, withdrawing promptly, keeping her face turned at the degree of downward inclination that rendered a servant effectively invisible to the people they served. She had grown up watching servants perform this precise disappearing act at her father's table, and she understood its mechanics now from the inside with a completeness she had not previously imagined. She was collecting the magistrate's soup bowl when Dravecourt turned. He was reaching for his wine glass, and the motion brought his gaze across the room in a slow, social sweep, the habitual surveillance of a man who liked to know the full population of any space he occupied, and for one terrible half-second, his eyes passed across her face. She had already looked down. She did not know if it had been enough. She crossed to the sideboard, set down the bowl with controlled steadiness, and did not look up for the count of 15. When she did, Dravecourt was speaking again to his neighbor, animated, uninterrupted, giving every appearance of a man whose attention had not snagged on anything. But across the length of the candlelit table, Edmund was looking directly at her. Not with the casual glance of a host monitoring his dining room. With intention. He held her gaze for precisely 2 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, and something in the set of his expression had shifted from the polite blankness of the dinner hour into something quieter and more serious. His eyes moved, almost imperceptibly, toward Dravecourt, and then back to her. He had seen it. Whatever there was to see, he had seen it. Isolde gave the smallest, most controlled nod of her life. She did not know what she was confirming. She did not know what she was asking for. She knew only that when Edmund Cavendish looked away from her and back to his guests and smoothly, without any visible transition, redirected the table's conversation away from Dravecourt and toward the magistrate with a question so well placed that the Viscount could not have retrieved the thread without visible effort, she exhaled for the first time in 40 minutes. She did not know what to call what he had just done. She thought, with a precision that surprised her, that she knew what it felt like. It felt like being stood in front of. There is a specific quality to the silence that follows a near escape. It is not peaceful, and it is not relief. It is the silence of a person standing at the edge of something and understanding, for the first time with complete clarity, exactly how far the drop is. Isolde understood it fully by the time the dinner service ended and the guests had retired to the drawing room, and she had carried the last of the serving dishes back to the kitchen and stood at the stone sink with her hands submerged in warm water, staring at nothing. Dravecourt had not recognized her. She was almost certain of it. Almost was doing considerable work in that sentence, and she knew it. Nell chattered beside her, bright and unbothered, relaying small observations from the dining room with the cheerful editorial confidence of someone who had decided that the world was interesting and deserved commentary. Isolde listened with half her attention and gave the other half to the problem of Dravecourt, how long he intended to stay, whether a second encounter would hold as well as the first, whether the altered hair and the plain dress and the coal-roughened hands were sufficient to sustain the distance between Lady Isolde Ashworth and the invisible girl at the sideboard. She was still in this calculation when Mrs. Pelham appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked directly at her. "His Grace wishes to see you," she said. "The study. Now." The kitchen went on around this statement, pots clattering, the scullery maid moving behind them, the fire settling in the grate, entirely indifferent to the fact that the world had just rearranged itself. "Me?" Isolde said. She kept her voice level and mild, the voice of a woman with no particular reason to find this alarming. Mrs. Pelham's expression did not change. "You are the only new member of staff, Miss Marsh. I presume that is the relevant distinction." A pause, measured and deliberate. "Do not keep him waiting." The walk from the kitchen to the Duke's study was not long. It felt long. The house had quieted from the dinner hour into its later, more contemplative register. The guests' voices a distant murmur from the drawing room, the candles in the corridor burning in their wall sconces with the steady, indifferent patience of things that did not know they were being watched. Isolde's footsteps were soft on the runner carpet. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She had performed composure for 7 days. She was capable of performing it a little longer. She knocked. A single, correct knock, not too timid, not too assured. "Come in," said Edmund. The study was smaller than the library and less forgiving in its atmosphere. A working room, its desk occupied with papers and correspondence, 2 candelabras burning on the mantelpiece above a fire that had been properly fed and meant business. Edmund stood at the window, not at the desk, with his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man who had been thinking for some time and had arrived somewhere definite. He turned when she entered. "Close the door," he said, "if you would." She closed it. He looked at her for a moment with that quality she had come to think of as his particular mode of attention, patient, direct, entirely without the social performance that most people layered over observation, the polite pretense that one was not looking precisely as carefully as one was. Then he said, "Will you curtsy for me?" It was not a question. It had the syntactical shape of a question but the weight of something else, a key, perhaps, placed deliberately on a table between 2 people who both understood what door it opened. Isolde held his gaze. For a moment, 3 seconds, she did not move. Then she curtsied. It was the same curtsy. It could not have been otherwise. 7 days of coal scuttles and lye soap and deliberate ordinariness had not altered the thing that had been built into her body across 17 years of careful formation, the easy descent, the composed recovery, the particular uprightness of a spine that had been corrected by a governess too many times to remember and had eventually simply accepted the correction as its natural state. When she rose, Edmund was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something gentler than that. Something that carried, at its edges, the faint quality of relief, as though a thing he had been uncertain about had resolved in a direction he had, quietly, hoped for. "I thought so," he said. "On the first morning." "I know," Isolde said. There was no point in the alternative. He nodded, as though this confirmed something further. He moved from the window to the chair behind the desk, not in the manner of a man asserting authority, but in the manner of a man who intended to stay for a real conversation and preferred to be comfortable. He did not sit behind the desk as a barrier. He angled himself beside it, leaning against its edge, which placed him level with her rather than above. "You are not going to tell me your name," he said. "I would rather not." "No," he agreed, as though this were entirely reasonable. "I would rather you did not either, actually." "Not yet. It would make certain things complicated." A pause. "The man at dinner tonight." Isolde said nothing. The fire spoke for a moment in her silence. "He was looking for someone," Edmund said. I could see it in the way he read the room. It was not social attention. It was a search. His eyes did not leave her face. "I do not need you to confirm this. I am telling you what I observed." "Why?" Isolde asked. "Because you should know what I know," he said simply. "I think you have been operating without adequate information, and I find that," He paused, choosing his word with visible deliberateness. Uncomfortable. It was such an unexpected answer that for a moment Isolde simply looked at him. This precise and guarded man, who had been deceived by a woman who smiled across dinner tables, who had closed an entire wing of his house and gone quiet and rebuilt himself from the inside. This man was sitting in his study at 10:30 in the evening and telling her, with complete composure, that her vulnerability made him uncomfortable. Not suspicious. Not morally aggrieved. Not interested in the legal dimensions of a forged character reference. Uncomfortable. On her behalf. "I am not able to tell you the full truth of my situation," she said at last, carefully. "Not yet. There are consequences for others that prevent me." "I understand consequences," Edmund said. "Then you understand why I have to ask you not to," she stopped. "Not to expose you," he finished, without inflection. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The candles on the mantelpiece burned with perfect, unhurried steadiness. Outside, somewhere in the house's further reaches, a door closed. "I am going to offer you something," Edmund said, "and I want you to hear it without the particular alarm I suspect it might initially produce." He looked at her with absolute directness. "You have my protection. Whatever you are concealing, and from whoever you are concealing it, for as long as you are within this house, you are within my house. And nothing enters Thornmere Hall that I have not admitted." The silence afterward was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of an offer made without condition by a man who had every reason, from his own personal history, to make no such offer to a woman who was demonstrably not what she claimed. Isolde felt something shift in her chest. Not quite safety. Safety was not yet available to her, and she knew it. But something adjacent to it. Something that had the quality of a hand extended in the dark. "Why?" she asked for the second time. It seemed to be the only question she had left. Edmund looked at her for a long moment before he answered. "Because you chose the later Milton," he said quietly. "And because anyone Dravecourt is hunting is almost certainly worth protecting." He straightened from the desk, which she understood as the conclusion of the interview. She moved toward the door, and then stopped, and turned, and curtsied once more. Not the automatic performance of a servant, but something deliberate. Something that was almost, in its way, a thank you. Edmund inclined his head in return. And Isolde Ashworth walked back through the quiet corridors of Thornmere Hall feeling, for the first time in 7 days, that she was not entirely alone in her own story. There is a particular freedom that arrives when a secret is no longer entirely one's own, when a single other person has been admitted to its edges, not enough to dissolve it, but enough to make the carrying of it fractionally more bearable. It does not resolve anything, but it changes the texture of the silence around it, the way a second candle changes a dark room, not flooding it with light, but altering what the darkness feels like. Isolde noticed the change in herself before she could fully account for it. It began small. She laughed once, genuinely, at something Nell said over breakfast, a short, unguarded laugh that surprised them both, and which Nell received with the delighted satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for it. She began to wake slightly before the pre-dawn bell rather than at it, which she recognized as the difference between dread and neutral anticipation. She carried coal scuttles with less internal commentary about their symbolic significance. She was still hiding. She was still Isolde Marsh. But she was carrying it differently now, with the posture of someone who knew that one person in the house could see through the costume and had chosen, deliberately, to leave it in place. Dravecourt had departed on the second morning, which Nell reported cheerfully, and Isolde received with a full-body relief of a person who had been holding a particular muscle tense for 36 hours and could finally release it. He had left no indication of his intentions, no forwarded correspondence. Nothing that suggested Thornmere Hall had meant more to him than a social call. Whether this was because he had not recognized her, or because he had and was recalibrating, she could not determine. She had filed the uncertainty and continued. What had changed in the days that followed was that Thornmere Hall had begun, quietly, almost imperceptibly, to feel less like a hiding place and more like a place. She noticed its particular rhythms, the way the morning light entered the east-facing corridor in a long, amber slide that lasted precisely 20 minutes before the angle shifted. The way the old clock in the servants' hall ran 3 minutes fast, and everyone had silently agreed to honor this fiction rather than correct it. The way cook, a large and apparently formidable woman named Mrs. Draper, kept a small pot of dried lavender on the kitchen windowsill that she touched, absently, whenever she was thinking. She noticed Edmund's rhythms too, though she told herself she was not doing this deliberately. He rode every morning before breakfast, regardless of weather. She knew this because she heard the stable yard from the attic window. He worked in his study through the late morning and emerged, most days, around noon to walk the grounds for approximately half an hour with the purposeful, non-leisurely gait of a man who used outdoor movement to process rather than to enjoy. He dined simply when alone, which Mrs. Pelham communicated to cook with a brevity that suggested it was a standing instruction rather than a nightly decision. He read every evening. She knew this because the library always smelled faintly of a second candle when she passed its door. He did not summon her again to the study, but twice, passing in the corridor, once near the library, once on the upper landing where she had no particular business being, and he appeared not to notice this inconsistency. He had looked at her directly. Not the managed glance of an employer acknowledging a servant. A real look, brief and level, that said, "I know you are still here." And then he had moved on, and she had moved on, and the household had continued around them both, entirely unaware. It was on a Thursday, 11 days into her stay, that the incident with the child occurred. She had been sent to the estate's home farm to deliver a message to the groundskeeper, a task that took her along the back lane past the row of stone cottages where several of Thornmere's tenant families lived. Outside the third cottage, she found a boy of perhaps 7 sitting on the step, with one leg extended before him at an angle that told her, even from 20 feet away, that something was wrong. He was not crying. He had the tight, deliberate face of a child who had decided that crying was not available to him, but he was pale, and the leg was very still. Isolde delivered her message in under 4 minutes and returned to the boy. His name was Thomas. He had fallen from the fence at the back of the property chasing a dog, and he believed, with the grim diagnostic confidence of a child who had broken a finger 2 years prior and knew how the category felt, that something was similarly wrong with his ankle. His mother was at the main house, working, he explained, with the stoic resignation of someone who understood that the world's business did not pause for accidents. Isolde sat down on the step beside him. She was not without resource in this area. Her mother had been a practical woman who believed that the daughters of landed families ought to understand basic nursing, and had supplemented their education accordingly with a volume on household medicine that Isolde had read, in the manner of a child who reads everything available, at age 11. She assessed the ankle with careful hands. No deformity, response to pressure localized and consistent with sprain rather than fracture, no swelling yet but coming, and she spoke to Thomas throughout in the calm, matter-of-fact tone she had discovered worked best with children in pain, which was to treat them as people who deserved accurate information. She bound the ankle with her apron strings, which was not elegant but was functional. She arranged for Thomas to be carried inside by the groundskeeper's assistant, who appeared at the right moment and was directed with a clarity and authority that he obeyed without question, which she registered only afterward. She was washing her hands at the farm pump when she became aware that Edmund was watching from the lane. He was on horseback. He must have ridden out later than usual that morning, and he had clearly been there for some time, because when she turned, he did not have the quality of someone who had just arrived. He had the quality of someone who had been watching long enough to have seen most of it. She straightened. She waited for him to speak. He did not speak immediately. He looked at her from a horse, that quiet, precise look, and then he looked at the cottage and then back at her. "The boy," he said. "A sprained ankle, I believe. He should be seen by the physician to confirm it, and he should stay off it for a week at minimum." Edmund nodded slowly. "The physician will be sent this afternoon." A pause, in which something moved across his expression that she could not fully interpret, but that carried, at its base, the quality of a man revising a calculation he thought he had already completed. "You have some medical training." "Some," she said, which was not untrue. He looked at her for one moment longer. Then he said, very quietly and with the particular precision of a man who chose every word deliberately. "You are wasted on coal scuttles."
He rode on.
Isolde stood at the pump for a long moment after he had gone, water still running cold over her fingers, and felt, with a force that surprised her entirely, that she did not want to leave Thornmere Hall. The realization arrived without warning and refused, once arrived, to be reclassified as anything simpler than what it was. She turned off the pump. She dried her hands. She walked back up the lane toward the house. She did not allow herself to think about it further. She thought about it constantly. There is a particular cruelty in the way the world reasserts itself precisely when one has begun, cautiously and against all better judgment, to forget that it is waiting. Isolde had been at Thornmere Hall for 18 days when the letter arrived. She found it on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside the fold of her spare apron where it should not have been, which meant it had been placed there deliberately by someone who knew which attic room she occupied and had moved through the house before the household woke. The handwriting on the outside was not her father's. It was her lady's maid Agnes's, dear, careful Agnes, who had been the one to help her pack the canvas bag, who had pressed her own shoes into Isolde's hands on that last dark morning and said, with the particular compressed emotion of a woman who understood that sentiment and practicality could not always occupy the same moment, simply, "Go." Isolde sat on the edge of her narrow bed and opened it. Agnes wrote plainly, because she always had and because the circumstances did not permit otherwise. The letter was short. It said the following: that Isolde's father, Lord Ashworth, had learned of Dravecourt's pursuit and had been, Agnes's word, notably diplomatic, affected by this knowledge. That in the weeks since Isolde's departure, the full character of the Viscount had made itself known to her father through channels that Agnes did not specify, but that had evidently been persuasive. That Lord Ashworth was prepared, for the first time, to reconsider the betrothal, but that he required Isolde's return to Ashworth Manor as a precondition of any formal negotiation with Dravecourt solicitors, on the grounds that a dissolution of the contract would be legally complex and required her presence and signature. He would not come to her. She must come to him. Agnes had added, in a smaller hand at the bottom, a single additional line that contained more information than all the rest. "Dravecourt has told your father he believes he knows where you are." Isolde read the letter twice. Then she folded it with the precise, mechanical care of a person whose hands require occupation while the mind works. Her father. She had not allowed herself to think about him at length because thinking about him completely required an emotional generosity she had not, in the immediate aftermath of his decision, been able to locate. Lord Ashworth was not a cruel man. This was important, and she had always known it, and it had made the betrothal simultaneously more difficult to bear and more difficult to simply condemn. He had arranged the match because Dravecourt's financial proposition had been substantial and because Isolde, at 23, was approaching an age at which her father's anxiety about her future had begun to override his attention to her wishes. He had not consulted her wishes. He had also not, she suspected, looked at Dravecourt with sufficient care to see past the title and the income to the man beneath. Men of her father's generation frequently did not look that carefully. She had spent most of her adult life understanding this without being able to change it. But he was reconsidering. Agnes's letter said he was reconsidering, and Dravecourt was closing in. She put the letter inside the volume of poetry, Edmund's book, still in her possession and now worn at the spine from use, and sat for a long while in the gray morning light, listening to the house wake up around her. The pre-dawn sounds of Thornmere Hall had become, in 18 days, entirely familiar. The clatter of the kitchen below, the particular creak of the third stair from the top that announced Nell's descent every morning, the distant clink of the stable yard, and beneath it all, the settled exhalation of a very old and well-maintained building that had been standing long enough to have its own opinions about impermanence. She had 3 choices. She could leave, tonight or tomorrow, vanish from Thornmere Hall the way she had vanished from Ashworth Manor, find another position in another household, continue the construction of Isolde Marsh in a new location. This had been her original plan. It now felt, she examined it honestly, insufficient. Dravecourt was hunting. He was telling her father he knew where she was. Another position in another house would buy her weeks, not resolution. She could go home, return to Ashworth Manor, participate in whatever negotiation her father was prepared to attempt with Dravecourt solicitors, and trust, with a trust she was not confident was warranted, that her father's reconsidering meant enough. This was the route Agnes recommended, she thought, reading between the careful lines. It was the route that offered, at least, the possibility of legal dissolution. But it required her to walk into a space her father controlled, while Dravecourt was already in correspondence with him, and rely on instruments that had not, thus far, demonstrated particular regard for her position. Or she could stay. Tell Edmund the full truth. Accept the protection he had offered and trust that it extended to whatever came next. She had been avoiding this option with the disciplined thoroughness of a person who knew that what they were avoiding was the only real option and could not yet afford to admit it. By mid-morning the question had become academic because a second message arrived, this one delivered not in secret, but in the normal course of a household's external correspondence, and set by the footman on the silver tray in the entrance hall along with the other morning post. She would not have known of its existence had Nell not been passing when the footman sorted through the pile, and had Nell not possessed the lively observational habits of a person for whom other people's correspondence was simply one of life's available entertainments. "There's a letter for His Grace from Viscount Dravecourt," Nell mentioned, in the same bright, uninvested tone she brought to all information. Came with the morning post. Thick one. Isolde's hands went still on the curtain. She was rehemming.
"Did it," she said.
"Mrs. Pelham's taken it up already." Nell tilted her head. "Are you all right? You've gone quite pale." "I am perfectly well," Isolde said. "I stitched my finger. It is nothing." She had not touched the needle in several minutes. She did not see Edmund until late afternoon, when the light had gone amber and long across the grounds, and she was returning from the kitchen garden with a basket of winter herbs for cook. He was coming from the direction of the estate's north boundary, still in his riding coat, and he had the quality she had come to associate with his thinking hours, a particular self-containment, a gaze that was directed inward rather than out.
When he saw her, he stopped. She stopped.
They stood in the kitchen garden path with herbs between them and the last of the afternoon light falling sideways across the frost-stiffened ground. "You have had a letter," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "How did you know?" "Because you have been carrying something heavy since breakfast," he said simply, "and it was not there yesterday." The evening was very quiet around them. The kitchen garden smelled of cold earth and rosemary.
"You also received one," she said.
"From Dravecourt." Something moved across his face. Not surprise, but the specific adjustment of a man whose calculations have been confirmed in a direction he had anticipated but not welcomed. "I did." "What did it say?" He was quiet for a moment, in the manner of a man deciding not how much to tell her, but how. "He is making inquiries," Edmund said carefully. "About the household. About recent additions to the staff." A pause. "He has framed it as a social communication. It is not." The rosemary in her basket released its scent into the cold air between them. "He knows I am here," Isolde said. She had stopped trying to make it smaller than it was. Edmund looked at her steadily. "I believe he suspects it. There is a meaningful distinction for the moment."
He paused.
"But the moment has a limited duration." She understood this. She had understood it since Agnes's letter. The question she had been turning all day in the cold water of her private deliberation resolved itself, suddenly and completely, in the kitchen garden with the frost underfoot, and Edmund Cavendish, looking at her with the direct and patient attention of a man prepared to hear whatever she chose to say. She was tired of being careful alone. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All of it. Tonight." Edmund held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, with the composed gravity of a man receiving significant news in the manner he had always intended to receive it. "The library," he said quietly. "After the house is settled." He walked on toward the house. She stood in the kitchen garden a moment longer, holding her basket of herbs, watching the last of the light leave the sky in long, cold streaks of amber and gray. She had made her choice. She was not at peace with it. But she was no longer carrying it alone, and that, she had learned, in 18 days of unexpected education at Thornmere Hall, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. She had intended to wait for the library. She had intended to sit in her narrow attic room until the house settled into its nighttime stillness, until the candles below were extinguished and the last footstep faded from the upper corridor, and then descend with composure and tell Edmund Cavendish the truth of herself in the calm, ordered manner of a woman who had prepared her words and knew their shape. What she had not accounted for was the rain. It began at 9:30, not gently, not with a polite preliminary of a drizzle, but suddenly and completely, the way October rain in England sometimes arrived, as though the sky had been holding it at considerable personal effort and had simply decided, all at once, to stop. It came against the attic window in great driven sheets, and the sound of it filled the room and filled Isolde's chest, and did something to the careful arrangement of her composure that she could not immediately correct. She had been sitting on her bed with Edmund's book of poetry open in her lap, not reading it, turning the letter from Agnes over and over in her hands. Nell and the other girl were already asleep. The room was dark except for her single candle stub, which threw a small and inadequate circle of warmth against the pressing dark. She thought about her father, not the abstract figure of her recent weeks, the man whose decisions she had been managing from a distance, but her actual father, who kept a spaniel named Commodore who slept across his feet every evening and who had taught her, when she was 9, to identify constellations from the upper terrace of Ashworth Manor by pointing with his walking stick at the dark sky and saying their names as though introducing old friends. She thought about whether he was afraid for her, or only afraid of the legal complication of her absence. She thought about how it was possible for both things to be simultaneously true. She thought about Dravecourt's letter, sitting somewhere in Edmund's study. She thought about Edmund. This last thought was the one that finally moved her off the bed. She did not take the candle. She did not plan her words. She descended through the dark house with the rain loud on every roof and window, and she went not to the library, but to the garden door at the end of the east corridor. The one she had noticed, in her first days, was often left unlatched, and she went through it and out into the rain. She was drenched within 30 seconds. This did not strike her, at the time, as particularly relevant. The kitchen garden was dark, its paths invisible, and she navigated by memory and the faint ambient light of the storm-bright sky above. She passed through the gate and onto the lawn proper, where the great elms along the southern boundary moved in the wind with a sound like rushing water beneath the rushing water above. She did not know what she was doing. She knew exactly what she was doing. Edmund was there. He was standing at the edge of the formal garden beneath the elm nearest the house, his coat already dark with rain, his face turned up very slightly toward the turbulent sky in the manner of a man who had come outside to think and found the weather an adequate companion for the quality of his thoughts. He heard her, or sensed her, perhaps, in the way that she had come to believe. He simply sensed things, and turned. He looked at her standing in the rain in her gray wool dress with her cap gone, and her dark hair already flattened against her face, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I was coming to find you." "I know," she said, which surprised them both, and which she recognized, as she said it, as simply true. She had thought all day about how to begin. She had constructed several versions of it, orderly, sequential, the facts arranged in the manner of a legal testimony. Standing in the rain in Edmund Cavendish's garden with the wind in the elms and the cold water running down the back of her neck, every version dissolved, and what came out instead was the unmanaged truth, plain and direct, the way things only come when one has exhausted all the alternatives. "My name is Lady Isolde Ashworth," she said. "My father is Lord Ashworth of Derbyshire. 6 weeks ago, he signed a betrothal contract on my behalf to Viscount Dravecourt. I was not consulted before the signing. I met Dravecourt twice, once at a dinner in London and once at my father's house, after the contract was already made, and both times I understood with complete clarity that he was a man I could not marry and remain intact."
She paused.
"I do not mean physically, though I do mean physically. I mean entirely." Edmund was very still. "I forged the reference letter myself," she continued. Agnes, my lady's maid, gave me the shoes. I chose Thormere Hall because it was distant enough and large enough that I believed one additional housemaid would go unremarked. A brief pause. I was incorrect about that. Something shifted at the corner of Edmund's mouth. He said nothing. My father is reconsidering the contract. Agnes's letter says so. But he requires me to return to Ashworth Manor to participate in the legal dissolution, and Dravecourt is telling him he knows where I am, and I cannot. She stopped. The rain came harder for a moment, and she let it, standing in it with her face turned slightly away. I cannot go back into that house while Dravecourt is still in correspondence with my father and believe that the outcome will be the one my father is promising. He is a good man who does not always see clearly. Dravecourt is a man who sees very clearly and uses it like a blade. She stopped speaking. The garden received the silence with the rain. Edmund had not moved throughout. He had listened with the quality she recognized as his most complete form of attention, not the listening of a man waiting for his turn, but the listening of a man for whom the other person's words were the only thing currently happening in the world. When she finished, the rain continued between them for a long moment. Then Edmund removed his coat. He crossed the distance between them, 4 steps, 5, and placed it around her shoulders with a care that was neither hasty nor performed. It was warm from his body. She held it closed with both hands and looked up at him. His face in the rain was very close and very serious and entirely without the closed, managed quality that she had seen on it in drawing rooms and doorways. He looked, she thought, with the sudden and inescapable precision of someone who has run out of reasons not to see clearly, like a man who had been somewhere very cold for a very long time and had just, unexpectedly, found warmth. You should have told me sooner, he said. His voice was low and even, with something at its depth that was not quite steadiness, or was steadiness worked for, which was a different thing entirely. I know, she said. I was afraid. Of what I would do. She considered this honestly. Of what I would want you to do, she said. The rain moved between them, and the elms moved above them, and Edmund Cavendish looked at Isolde Ashworth in the dark garden of his house with an expression that had nothing managed in it at all. The contract, he said quietly, is a legal instrument. It requires 2 willing parties to hold. One party is unwilling. He held her gaze. Dravecourt's claim depends on your father's cooperation. Your father is reconsidering. He paused, and something settled in his expression, not hardness, but resolution. The look of a man arriving at a decision he has been approaching for some time. I have a title. I have a solicitor. I have, the corner of his mouth moved, fractionally, certain social and legal levers available to me that Dravecourt will find it extremely difficult to match. Isolde stared at him. I would have ended it weeks ago, he said. If I had known. The rain was very loud in the elms. The garden smelled of cold earth and wet stone, and the particular clean devastation of a storm moving through. Why? She asked. For the 3rd time. The only question left. Edmund looked at her for a long, unhurried moment, with the direct and unguarded attention of a man who had decided that caution had cost him enough. You know why, he said quietly. She did know. She had known, she thought, since a midnight library and a borrowed book and a candle held between 2 people who had both, separately, chosen wakefulness over the safety of sleep.
She did not say it.
Neither did he. The rain said it, and the dark garden said it, and the coat warm around her shoulders said it more plainly than either of them, in that moment, was prepared to say it themselves. It was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. Edmund Cavendish rode to London on a Wednesday morning, 3 days after the rain. He told no one the full purpose of the journey. He told Mrs. Pelham he had business with his solicitor, which was true, as far as it went, and he told his estate manager, Harwick, that he expected to return by Friday. He did not tell Isolde he was going, because he had told her the night before in the library, quietly and completely, and she had listened with the focused stillness of a woman who understood that the plan being laid before her was being executed on her behalf, and had the grace not to protest the gift of it. She had protested anyway. You do not have to do this, she had said. It is not your obligation. It is not your. I know what it is, Edmund had said, with a calm that closed the argument without dismissing it. I am going. She had looked at him for a long moment with those clear, direct eyes that had never, from the very first morning, looked at him the way a servant looked at an employer. Then she had said, very quietly, be careful of him. He is not what he presents himself to be. Neither, Edmund had replied, with the precise and level tone he reserved for things he meant completely, am I. London in late October was grey and purposeful, the streets wet with recent rain, the air carrying that particular metropolitan compound of coal smoke and river damp that announced the city to Londoners before they could see it. Edmund arrived at his townhouse in Grosvenor Square by early afternoon, met briefly with Harwick's London counterpart regarding an unrelated estate matter, and then sent 3 notes, one to his solicitor, one to his man of business, and one to a certain Lord Alderton, who sat on 2 significant committees, had known Dravecourt for 15 years, and whose opinion of the Viscount, Edmund had reason to believe, was both low and well evidenced. The following morning he met with his solicitor, a composed and meticulous man named Fellows who had handled Cavendish family legal matters for 22 years and had the particular quality of a man who had seen enough of human nature to be unsurprisable. Edmund placed before him Agnes's letter, which Isolde had surrendered, with clear personal cost, for this purpose, along with a precise, detailed account of Dravecourt's conduct, the circumstances of the betrothal, and a specific legal question regarding the conditions under which a betrothal contract could be dissolved in the absence of the betrothed party's consent. Fellows read everything without expression, asked 4 questions, made 7 notes, and then looked up. The contract, he said, is imperfectly drawn. Lady Isolde's consent is recorded as given, but there is no independent witness signature to that consent, which, combined with testimony regarding the timeline and circumstances, gives us considerable ground. He set down his pen. Dravecourt will not capitulate without resistance. I am not asking him to capitulate quietly, Edmund said. I am asking you to ensure that the alternative to quiet capitulation is sufficiently unattractive. Fellows permitted himself the smallest possible smile. I understand, Your Grace. The meeting with Lord Alderton was conducted over an early dinner at Alderton's Club, a long, unhurried conversation that ranged across several subjects before arriving, with the appearance of natural drift, at the subject of Viscount Dravecourt. What Edmund learned over the course of that dinner confirmed what Isolde had told him and added dimensions she had not known. Dravecourt's financial position was substantially less stable than its presentation suggested. The income he had represented to Lord Ashworth as reliable was in fact leveraged against 3 properties currently encumbered by debt. The Ashworth match had been, Alderton confirmed with the dry specificity of a man who had done his own investigating, primarily a financial acquisition. The Ashworth estate's unencumbered capital had been the precise instrument Dravecourt required. Edmund thanked Alderton for a pleasant dinner and returned to Grosvenor Square with the particular, cold satisfaction of a man who has confirmed that he was right about something he had hoped to be wrong about. On Thursday morning, Fellows arranged a meeting with Dravecourt's solicitor. Edmund did not attend this meeting personally.
He did not need to.
Fellows attended with a contract, with the documentation of its procedural deficiencies, with a carefully prepared summary of Dravecourt's financial position, entirely legally obtained, through a combination of public records and Alderton's testimony, and with a single sealed letter from Edmund addressed to Dravecourt personally, which contained 12 sentences and no salutation, and which Edmund had written in his study at Grosvenor Square the previous evening with the same precise, unhurried attention he brought to all documents that required permanent meaning. He had read it once after writing it, corrected 1 word, and sealed it. The content of the letter was never repeated publicly. What was known was its effect. By Thursday afternoon, Dravecourt's solicitor had contacted Fellows with a proposal. By Thursday evening, a counter-proposal had been delivered. By Friday morning, earlier than Edmund had anticipated, which told him something significant about the structural vulnerability of Dravecourt's position, a preliminary agreement had been reached. The betrothal contract would be formally dissolved. The matter would be handled through solicitors on both sides. No public statement would be required or made. Dravecourt's cooperation, Fellows explained with careful neutrality, had been secured by the cumulative weight of the legal vulnerabilities in the contract, the documented financial discrepancies, and the prospect, clearly outlined in Edmund's letter, of what a duke with motivation, a solicitor of Fellowes' ability, and a close acquaintance with Lord Alderton might, if required, choose to make publicly known. Edmund thanked Fellowes, paid his fee, considerably and without complaint, and was in his carriage heading north before noon on Friday. He drove through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping once to change horses, arriving at Thornmere Hall in the full dark of a Friday night with the autumn cold sharp and clean after London's layered air. The house was lit in its lower windows, the warm, domestic amber of a household in its evening routine, and the sight of it, which had been merely familiar for years, struck him now as something he did not have an adequate word for. Something that was home in the way that home meant more than architecture. He gave the horse to the stable lad and went in through the front entrance, handing his coat and hat to the footman, who confirmed that the household had dined and the upper guests, there were none, were settled for the evening. "Is Mrs. Pelham in the servants' hall?" Edmund asked. "I believe so, your grace." "And the housemaid, Marsh, where is she?" The footman, to his credit, did not register this question as unusual, or if he did, his training held. "The kitchen, I believe, your grace. She took supper late." Edmund walked through his own house with the familiar knowledge of a man who knew every corridor by heart, through the green baize door and down the back passage toward the kitchen, a route he had not taken since a leaking pipe in the east scullery 4 years prior, and which felt, now, entirely natural. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the evening's bread and the remnants of the fire. Mrs. Draper had gone, her domain tidied to its nighttime order, the pots hung, the surfaces scrubbed. The room was not empty. Isolde sat at the long kitchen table with Edmund's book of poetry open before her, a cup of something warm between both hands, her dark hair loose around her shoulders in the manner of a woman who has reached the end of her day and released the last of its requirements. She was wearing her gray wool dress, and her white apron and her cotton cap had been set on the table beside the book as though she had reached up and removed it without thinking. She looked up when he entered. He had rehearsed nothing. He was not, constitutionally, a man who rehearsed. He had always thought that rehearsal was what people did when they did not yet know what they meant. He knew, with complete precision, what he meant. Edmund Cavendish, 5th Duke of Westhaven, Master of Thornmere Hall and its 11,000 acres, member of 2 significant parliamentary committees and holder of a title that had not bowed to anything in 4 generations of recorded family history, stopped in the center of the kitchen flagstones.
And bowed.
A proper, formal bow, not the abbreviated nod of social acknowledgement, not the perfunctory dip of a man being polite, but a full and deliberate bow of the kind that was reserved, in the precise grammar of their era's physical language, for persons of significant regard. The kind of bow one offered to a woman one intended to honor. He held it for a breath. He rose. Isolde stared at him. And then, wholly, suddenly, without the management she had been applying to her expressions for the better part of 3 weeks, she laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and bright, the laugh of a woman who has been holding an enormous weight and has had it lifted so completely and so unexpectedly that the body's only available response is joy. It filled the kitchen and bounced off the copper pots and disappeared up into the warm air above the fire, and it was the most unmanaged, and therefore the most completely beautiful thing Edmund had heard in longer than he could immediately calculate. He stood in the kitchen and looked at her laughing and felt something that he had not felt in 3 years, a lightness, precise and specific, that was not the absence of seriousness, but its complement. The thing that made seriousness sustainable. When she had recovered, she looked at him with her eyes bright and her color high and all the careful layers of Isolde Marsh finally, completely gone. "It is done?" she asked. "It is done," he said. "Fellows will have the formal dissolution within the fortnight. Your father has been notified through appropriate channels."
He paused.
"Drave Court will not trouble you again." She absorbed this. He watched her absorb it, the slow, full-body release of a fear that had been carried so long it had begun to feel structural, like something that belonged there. "I owe you," she began. "You owe me nothing," he said, with the quiet finality of a man closing a particular kind of account permanently. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen fire settled with a soft, domestic sound. "Then I would like," Edmund said, with the precision of a man who has decided that he has been careful long enough and that the alternative to careful was, in this instance, simply honest, "to ask you something. Formally, and without any expectation that the answer must be what I hope it will be." Isolde set down her cup. She straightened in her chair. She looked at him with clear, steady eyes. Edmund did not kneel. Kneeling was not, he had always thought, the most honest posture for an honest question. It put the asker too far below the person being asked, and he was not below her, and he did not wish to pretend otherwise. He stood before her, in the kitchen of his own house, and asked Lady Isolde Ashworth if she would consent to be his duchess. He used those words. Exactly those words. Consent. The deliberateness of it was not lost on either of them. She did not answer immediately. She rose from her chair, which brought her to her full height, and she was tall, he had always noticed, with the posture of a woman who had never been taught to make herself smaller. She looked at him from that height with an expression that moved through several things he could see clearly and one or two he could not, and he waited with the patience of a man who understood that the quality of the answer depended entirely on the quality of the silence that preceded it. "Yes," said Isolde Ashworth, with the directness that had been her most consistent quality from the very first morning. She curtsied. It was the same curtsy, impeccable, unhurried, unmistakably itself. But this time, at its conclusion, she did not look at the floor. She looked directly at him. Edmund offered his hand. She took it. Outside, the October night pressed cold and clean against the kitchen windows, and Thornmere Hall settled around them with the deep, particular quiet of a house that has been waiting, in its patient and architectural way, for exactly this. They were married in December, quietly, in the parish church at the edge of the Thornmere estate, with Nell weeping openly in the second pew and Mrs. Pelham maintaining her composure, with the disciplined ferocity of a woman who had decided that composure was a moral position and intended to hold it regardless of provocation. Lord Ashworth attended. He sat in the front pew with Commodore the Spaniel's lead wound around his wrist. He had brought the dog without asking permission, and nobody had thought to stop him, and he watched his daughter walk toward Edmund Cavendish with the expression of a man who understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late and is therefore more complete than the kind that arrives on time, that he had nearly made an irreversible mistake. He did not say this to Isolde directly. He said it, instead, by taking her hand before she walked down the aisle and holding it for a long moment without speaking, and she had understood him entirely, because she was his daughter and had always been better at reading him than he was at reading himself. She had squeezed his hand and walked forward. The wedding was not large, but it was real, which Isolde had decided, somewhere between the kitchen and the church, was the only quality that mattered. She wore a dress of deep winter blue that Agnes had brought from Ashworth Manor along with the rest of her things, packed with the meticulous care of a woman who had been waiting for this particular errand for some time. She wore no veil. She wanted to see everything clearly, and she did. Edmund, at the altar, looked at her with the expression she had first glimpsed in a rainy garden and had not, since, been able to unsee. The look of a man for whom warmth had been a theoretical concept long enough that its actual arrival was required to be examined with some attention, to confirm it was real. It was real. By the following spring, Thornmere Hall had acquired several new qualities. There was a particular armchair in the library that had been repositioned, moved from its place at the desk's edge to the fireside, angled slightly toward its pair, because two people read there now most evenings and proximity was preferable to arrangement. The astronomy section, once confined to the far left corner, had expanded by 7 volumes chosen by Isolde and integrated, with Edmund's full cooperation, throughout the shelves according to a system that made sense to both of them and would have baffled anyone else. The attic room that had briefly housed Isolde Marsh was occupied by a new housemaid named Dorothy, who had a genuine character reference and no forged history, and who found the previous occupant's reputation, kind, steady, slightly mysterious, had apparently read an enormous amount, to be a perfectly adequate inheritance. Nell had been promoted to lady's maid, which she had accepted with the bright, uncomplicated pleasure of someone who had not been angling for it, but was entirely prepared to receive it. Mrs. Pelham had said nothing whatsoever about any of it, which, Isolde had come to understand, was her most sincere form of approval. It was in June of the following year, the summer of 1815, London in its full seasonal self, that they attended their first ball together as husband and wife. The Alderton Summer Assembly, held in a Mayfair house that had been designed specifically to accommodate the ambitions of its hostess, and had largely succeeded. It was the first significant society event at which they had appeared as a couple, and London society, which had opinions about everything and time to develop them thoroughly, had opinions about this. The Duke of Westhaven had married quietly. He had married a woman few people knew well, Lord Ashworth's daughter. Yes, pleasant girl. Not widely seen in the last season, there had been something about a betrothal to Dravecourt, though that had apparently dissolved, and he had married her with a swiftness and a conviction that the gossips found simultaneously unsatisfying, because there was so little scandal to it, and deeply interesting, because the Duke of Westhaven had not been expected to marry at all. Edmund moved through the assembly with the composed, unhurried authority of a man entirely comfortable being observed and entirely uninterested in performing for the observers. He kept Isolde beside him, not with the possessive adjacency of a man displaying an acquisition, but with the easy, natural proximity of two people who had simply become accustomed to occupying the same space and found the alternative mildly inconvenient. Isolde wore silk, pale gold, the color of the first 20 minutes of a November morning, and she wore it with the same unconscious uprightness that had given her away in the entrance hall of Thornmere Hall on an October morning that felt, and did not feel, like a lifetime ago. She was speaking with Lady Alderton when the question came, posed with the light, social curiosity that stood in politely for more direct inquiry, the kind of question that London ballrooms produced as naturally as music. "You must tell me," Lady Alderton said, with the warmth of a woman who is genuinely interested rather than merely performing the gesture, "how you and the Duke came to know one another. One hears so little, and what one hears is never enough." Isolde glanced across the room to where Edmund stood in conversation with her husband. As though feeling her attention, he always felt her attention, which she had stopped finding surprising. He looked up. "We met at Thornmere Hall," she said, returning to Lady Alderton with a smile that was composed and warm and concealed, with practiced ease, the full dimensions of its own amusement. "In the autumn." "And it was immediate?" Lady Alderton pressed, with the hopeful brightness of a woman who believed in romantic narrative and wanted this one to be good. Isolde considered the question with all the seriousness it deserved. She considered an October morning and a coal scuttle and a pair of borrowed shoes. She considered a library at midnight and a candle held between two people in the dark. She considered a rainy garden and a coat placed over her shoulders, and the most important bow she had ever witnessed, executed on kitchen flagstones in front of a cold fire and a cup of cooling tea. "Not immediate exactly," she said pleasantly. "He knew before I did." Across the room, Edmund, who could not have heard this, chose this precise moment to look at her again. With that look, the one with nothing managed in it, and Isolde Ashworth, Duchess of Westhaven, in her pale gold silk with the whole of a London ballroom between them, curtsied to him. Just once. Just slightly. He smiled. It was, those nearest to him would later remark to one another with some puzzlement, the most unguarded expression they had ever seen on the Duke of Westhaven's face. As though something that had been held closed for a very long time had simply, finally opened, which, of course, was exactly what had happened. It had begun, as so many true things do, with a curtsy.